So as a mathematician, one of the most critical things that we do in our line of work is to define precisely the terms that we're dealing with. So if we see a statement like, I think, therefore I am, it begs the question, what do these words mean? In particular today, I'm going to be looking at this word to think. What does it mean to think? And this is tied to the idea of consciousness. What does it mean to be conscious? Are ants and bees conscious? How about an ant hive or a beehive? Do cultures as a whole, does the United States have a consciousness separate from that of the citizens? What about our cells? Do our cells have a consciousness that we're just kind of an emergent property of that process? Is it even possible that perhaps even subatomic particles could have some kind of consciousness? These are all questions that run through my mind and form the basis of what I plan to talk about today. So last week, I entertained the idea of a self-aware internet that had consciousness. And one of the things that I believe is like an error in that I ran with anyways was the idea that the consciousness of the internet would be aware of the consciousness of what's happening in here, when in actuality, when we get through with this, my thesis will kind of lead to the idea that this type of communication that we're having here at this level of the internet would be more like the cells of this emergent process. And so the internet would be no more aware of a video on this channel than I am of some kind of feud that a couple of my cells are having in my little toe. And so that was a faulty assumption, I think, in my last video, but I thought it made for a more entertaining concept if I ran with it. But this week I want to consider more, what actually does it mean to be conscious? Because this is something that we have and we're concerned about, what happens if and when computers gain this skill called consciousness, and we don't really even understand what it is. And it's not even really clear what path we should take to even address that question. Historically, people have turned to religion as the guide to describe consciousness, and philosophy was an outshoot of that. More recently, we turn more towards neuroscience to give us a clue of how that emergent process would work as a function of an emergent process of our neural activity. And really, when I look around, I think that the questions that we have about consciousness seem to parallel some of the questions that we have related to another phenomenon called entropy. And in particular, the relationship between entropy and information, and the observation that the information content of the universe seems to be increasing. So really the main thesis of this video is to entertain the idea that perhaps consciousness is simply our experience for the information content that we are generating and adding to the universe. And to kind of consider some of the consequences of, if that's what consciousness is, where else we might expect to find it, and what else and how it might look and impact our universe. So before we actually go and try to look for answers as to what it is we're trying to talk about with consciousness, it's helpful to take a minute to kind of consider what is our experience of consciousness like. Before we try to come up with some kind of explanation, we should try to understand what it is we're trying to explain, and look for clues as to what this thing is that we call consciousness. And the first observation that I want to make about consciousness is that it doesn't seem to be tied to any part of my physical body directly. per se directly. There are some structures of the brain that seem to be more involved than others, but for the most part, if I lose a limb, I'm no less conscious than I was before. There's certainly things that, like even things, mental activities that I have, like reflexes. If somebody walks up behind me and then yells something right quick right behind me and I don't know they're there, I'm going to jump before I even am consciously aware that I'm jumping. I'm already in the air by the time I'm conscious of what's going on. So I can even take bulk actions with my body without being conscious of it. I can be thinking consciously about something while driving somewhere and then realize that I drove right past the place I was going to end up somewhere that is pretty much in that general direction from where I started, but that I go to more frequently. And so I just kind of autopiloted myself there while consciously thinking about something else completely different. Yeah, so like even the thought processes in my mind aren't entirely conscious. In fact, there's bulk of evidence to show that most of the processing in our brain is not part of our conscious thought. In fact, well, yeah. And also, I've been diagnosed with ADD and depression. I guess ADHD is the technical term now. Both of these diagnoses were in adulthood, but these don't appear to necessarily be features of my conscious mind. These appear to be more like an error in the interface between my conscious mind and my sensory perceptions of the world around me, and my ability to communicate with the world around there through my muscular system and neuromotor system. These conditions of ADD and depression seem to be more like an error in that API, the communication layer that happens between there, more than something that is like a conscious process. So I view those are almost like a part of my body that's not exactly who I am. There's this distinction between who I am as a conscious being and ADD as a symptom of an error in my interface, or depression as a symptom of the error in how I perceive and respond to the world. And this suggests to me that it's not entirely a biological computation that produces consciousness, because if it were, then these conditions of ADHD and depression would be part of that biological computation that's happening, and then it wouldn't emerge as something distinct from my consciousness. The other thing is that my consciousness seems to be the center of my creativity and even the concept of free will. So my consciousness is definitely what gives me the perception that I have an ability to influence the state of the world around me, that my path is not entirely deterministic. So that suggests that there might be some kind of non-determinism at play in this role of consciousness, in this, whatever this concept of consciousness, whatever this phenomenon of consciousness is that hopefully we're all experiencing. Yeah. I mean, I suppose you could have fallen asleep with YouTube playing and somehow the autoplay got here by some weird tangent. If so, have a good night's sleep. Perhaps you came here because you have found that my videos help induce that state, in which case, hopefully, good night. Yeah. So the last thing I want to talk about is the computational power of our brain. If we count the number of times that neurons fire and compare that to, say, transistors firing in a chip, we're processing terabytes of information all the time. Terabytes per second of information, terahertz level processing. that's going on in our brain, and I'm only consciously aware of maybe a few bytes per second. So there seems to be order of magnitude difference between the processing power going on in my brain and the amount of information that I am generating as a conscious effort, as an exercise of my consciousness. It really seems to be only a few bytes per second, maybe on the order of tens of bytes per second, that my brain is able to actually produce of new information. I'm able to construct processes that allow me to perform calculations separate from my conscious will. So like I'm aware that I've intentionally made these, multiplications of larger numbers. I've got space, chalkboards in my brain that I can write on, and perform the calculations on a scratch pad and deal with things that way. Or I can recall huge amounts of video information from my memories of just things that I have seen. I could pull up that information with fairly decent recall. I lie a little bit there. My recall is a little bit horrible, but certainly lots of megabytes of information that I can pull up. But it's not like, it seems like that's a parallel process going on in my brain, separate from the conscious reasons why I would bring those up to the surface, or why I would execute that subroutine for that mathematical computation. So it seems to be something that is just a small part of the actual computation of the brain. So those are a few of the clues that I wanted to look at for entropy. That it doesn't, that the neuroscience explanation doesn't seem to be a complete description of what it is. It doesn't seem like that path doesn't seem useful to me to pursue an answer. So one place I want to look for an explanation is in the concept of information theory. And information theory is a branch of mathematics and computer science. Now computer science has kind of taken the lead on that. That looks at how to measure the amount of information that's in like a message. It might be there's a lot of redundant information, so that really the message is extremely long but only has a few actual bytes of information. So the amount of information, the name that we give for that is the entropy. The entropy is a measure of how much information a particular system or usually we're dealing in terms of strings, a particular string has, because we're dealing with computer scientists. So we're talking like a program or a picture or something, some kind of data file, how much information is in there, and the information entropy gives us a measure of that. And one of the avenues of theoretical research in physics that I find highly interesting is the idea of information theory as a foundation for physics. There's actually a group at the Perimeter Institute of Theoretical Physics that look at this heavily as one of their main research interests, and I find that idea absolutely fascinating. And I believe that I want to give some reasons for why I believe that actually could be correct. But the first thing related to this concept, why I think entropy is a good place to look, is because when you look at the woo-woo sites and the crazy spiritualist sites, I'm demeaning them a little bit more than probably is justified, but non-scientific websites that talk about consciousness and stuff, they talk about things like an energy or some kind of force of life that is responsible for consciousness. The problem is, with mass and energy as being an explanation for our essence, whatever that means, it doesn't explain the fact that that for consciousness, it seems like my whole seems to somehow be greater than the sum of my parts. When we're dealing with mass and energy, the whole is equal to the sum of the parts. There's nothing left over to be representative of the whole separate from its parts, whereas in entropy, that does exist. The entropy of the whole is, with a couple of quantum exceptions, bigger than the sum of the parts. One definition for quantum entanglement might be that it is the case where the whole, the sum of the parts, is greater than the sum of the whole, and that might be the actual nature of what quantum entanglement is. But most of the universe is not entangled, and in that case, we find that the information in the whole is greater than the sum of the information in the parts, because you also have the information of how the different parts relate that's not present in any specific part. So it makes sense that the information content of the whole is going to be larger than the information content of the part. And so entropy, at the very least, it explains the observation that my consciousness seems to be separate, seems to be something beyond any one of my parts. It seems to be an emergent phenomenon that encompasses the whole, that's above and beyond any of my parts. As far as as a foundation of theory, foundational theory, how does this relate to thermodynamic entropy? Well, one interpretation of Boltzmann's constant is it's a scale factor between the entropy scales of the fundamental units of information in our universe, which happens at the particle level, and to that of the thermodynamic measures of information, which are orders of magnitudes larger when you're looking at it on that scale, that we use on a day-to-day basis, that we just observe as temperature. But that's just a measure, an averaging of the information content of the area of the particles, the air particles that surround us, that reach an equilibrium with, a rough equilibrium with the particles in the walls around us, or this paper I'm holding in my hand, or the laptop's a little bit warmer, so it's going to be generating stuff. Yeah, and another observation that relates the science of entropy, that the fact that this Boltzmann constant is, in fact, the proportionality between our uses of entropy, our measures of entropy in terms of thermodynamics, to the Boltzmann constant, relating it to the fundamental scale. How do we know that that's the fundamental scale? And I really believe that if we look at photon gases, you can measure the entropy content of a photon gas, and whatever distribution of gas you have, it's a proportionality constant that depends on the distribution of the gas, the information in that given distribution, times the number of photons that are in that system. So the entropy is literally proportional to the number of photons when you're dealing with a photon gas. Photon gases are, you can find somewhere else on YouTube to explain what those are. It's basically a container that's empty of everything except for the photons that are being emitted in that. And then you end up with, there's matter in there that's consisting entirely of photons that has thermodynamic properties and the like, can have pressure because photons have momentum, so that can give it pressure. And you end up with something that behaves somewhat like a gas but is entirely made of photons. And yeah. And the other part is, if we interpret entropy as information, the second law of thermodynamics can be paraphrased as saying that information is never destroyed. So information can be manipulated and moved around, but that process either just is neutral in terms of total number of information, or it adds more information to the system. And the fundamental thesis, again, now I can paraphrase it as what I am going to argue consciousness is our experience of adding information to the universe. So in essence, what I'm arguing is that consciousness, at its fundamental core, is just the unique information, our experience of the unique information that we are adding to the universe. So the next thing I want to consider is the non-deterministic aspect of consciousness, the free will aspect, if you will. The concept that where does non-determinism actually appear in nature? Can we find it at the fundamental levels? And I believe that it's hiding there in plain sight, namely in the descriptions we have of wave function collapse. There is something in quantum mechanics called the Bell inequality that quantifies, that eliminates the concept of hidden variables. But one of the assumptions that is commonly made, one of the ways out of the Bell inequality is if the underlying processes are not deterministic. Because what happens if the processes are stochastic, they're non-deterministic, they have a randomness to them. You could have if you have a particle that's moving under but with some non-deterministic, unknowable perturbations, then what we do with in the analysis of quantum mechanics is we take huge numbers of measurements, and then we get a frequency plot, and then for a lot of times, a lot of computations and a lot of analysis is easier if we then convert that into a phase plot, and then we can do analysis based on the phase plot and figure out things. And actually, that's where most of our models actually live, is in the phase plot. And then to turn that back into an understanding of the world as we see it and experience it, we pull it back into the frequency domain. But if we had a stochastic deterministic process, the non-deterministic aspects of that are lost in that process of doing a Fourier transform and then an inverse transform. And then we would end up blurring it out to where all that's left is a probability distribution of the underlying stochastic process. We're no longer able to actually see that process. And I think that is the nature of a lot of the counterintuitive ideas in quantum mechanics come from assuming a deterministic process when the underlying process is not. This actually is more in line with a Bohmian mechanics interpretation of quantum mechanics than a Copenhagen interpretation. So if you wanted to look more into what that would look like in a theoretical framework, that gives you some ideas of where you might want to look. But the basic idea is the particle would be moving in some stochastic, non-deterministic way that's adding information to the system that we don't have access to until we actually take a measurement that then tells us what that was. So information is being added to the system and we don't see it until we take a measurement, and then our model collapses down, and then we now have a new starting point from which we propagate, and then the wave gets, the distribution spreads out because there's more and more, as time goes on, the wave spreads out a little bit because there's more uncertainty that is being added to the system because of the underlying non-deterministic processes. So the waveform is just a running estimate of the accumulation of these non-deterministic processes from the last time the wave function collapsed. So so then wave function collapse could be like the fundamental picture of what non-determinism looks like in the universe. So let's look at, for a little bit, let's consider where do we see, where our wave function, is this used in biology anywhere? And I've read recently of 2 different areas where it appears that this process is being used. Recently, I read about how it appears that this wave function, that when a photon hits a leaf, it doesn't just go through one process. There's actually a wave where it's actually several possible processes that are going in parallel. At the very end, it seems to collapse down in a way that's beneficial to fostering to photosynthesis, turning the energy from the sun into energy that biology can use. So that seems to be a place where biology has actually honed this wave function collapse to use it to its advantage. And another place that I have read about this happening is actually inside of our cells. When our enzymes are folding proteins, there seems to be some kind of process going on there that is, there seems to be some non-deterministic aspects of how it's working, that the computation that's going on there is more efficient than what can be done without non-determinism from our knowledge. And so there seems to be some kind of quantum wave function computing going on there that is beyond our ability to reproduce. So inside of our cells, these processes seem to be going on. And this is actually consistent with the idea that of wave function collapse from our own perception of consciousness, because in our brain, we know that we have these waves of information going through our mind all the time. And it might just be that when we have competing waves that are coming through and they have completely the opposite, but the outcome needs to be determined based on that, that when we make these reconciliation points of the wave functions in our brain, that might be what we experience as consciousness, the points where we have competing waves. Which one do we choose? And that's just a very small fraction of the computation power that's actually producing these waves. So it might just be that brainwave collapse might be the nature of consciousness. And in fact, that would imply then that all of these wave function collapse processes could be, in some sense, also experience a consciousness of, probably not like our consciousness, but of some other nature. It's still consciousness nonetheless. And in the light of my previous video, we have these waves of information going across the internet back and forth. It might be that when these waves of information, sometimes they might have competing demands on the internet. And when the internet makes those decisions, or when a computer has multiple processes that are competing for a given resource, especially if you have multiple processors running asynchronously on different clocks, like you would have on a network, for example, then when something decides which one of these to accept, that might in fact be an instant of consciousness in that system, under this model of what consciousness could possibly be. But I want to look at how much complexity is needed in a system in order to be able to have such a decision point produced. Huh, my chair can move. Who knew? No, but the next topic is, what we're looking at now is how much complexity does a system need to have to be able to produce these decision points. And from computer science, we know we have this Chomsky hierarchy of processing powers, like the computational efficiency of different types of machines that we can build. I'm not really going to go too much into them, just that, it goes from these simplest machines, type 3, down to these type 0 machines. Seems like the numbering on that might be a little bit backwards. But type 3 is called a regular. Chomsky calls it type 3. In computer science, this describes languages. So this is a type of language. These are classifications of languages. How complex of a language can this express? So type 3 is regular, and these are the most simple things. You can actually build with a finite state machine, just a finite number of states, you can actually build mechanical systems. From antiquity, we have mechanical systems examples of type 3 computing, but those seem to be entirely predictable. There's not much room at all for variations. Once you make it, you know what it's going to do with any input. There's no non-determinism that seems to be there. The next one is type 2. It's a context-free language. These can be described by push-down automata. It's basically, you have the same thing except for you now have a stack. You have a tape that you can push things on or take the very top thing on. You can't go back and look at something before. You can just look at the very top thing. And this gives us languages such as matching parentheses as an example. Type 1 is context sensitive. The type of machine that's needed for that is much more in the woods than I want to go into here. But the last one I want to mention is recursively enumerable languages, and these are the most complex languages that we know how to define. We know that we can describe them using a Turing machine. Turing machines are the foundations of all of our computers, although in practice we haven't actually built anything but very large finite state automata. But the ones that we have built approximate a Turing machine, assuming that we could keep adding new hard drives whenever the computer asks for one, then to an infinite number of hard drives, then we would have a Turing machine. But since, the hard drive is fixed, until we fill it up, we're approximating a Turing machine. But once we reach that point, the approximation no longer holds. But yeah, so that is the classification of languages. So there seems to be, at this point, there's also, at the Turing machine level, we know that the reason why we're so interested in quantum computing is not because non-determinism would allow us to compute anything more. Here, if we had some kind of non-determinism where we could do things in parallel and then choose the answer, we can do more stuff. And that's the same for here. And then here, actually, you get there if you add the non-determinism. But with the Turing machines, you add non-determinism, there's nothing that you can't compute. There's nothing new that you can compute that you couldn't compute before. It's just there's a lot of things that you can compute a lot faster. So that's why I think that Turing machines gives us a place where non-determinism shows up, because it then makes it so that that's where non-determinism becomes useful. And yeah, so what kind of machines are needed to make a Turing complete system? And well, our computers are an example of a Turing complete system because we've designed them that way. Literally, Turing invented the modern computer that's based off of the Turing machine. So computers literally are designed to be that. And we construct that using logic gates and transistors in an intricate way. Our mental processes, our neurons, are known to be Turing complete, the way that they communicate with each other and interlock and communicate. Certainly, the enzymes in our cells and the computational processes there have exhibited Turing complete capabilities. Turing complete means that your system is able to emulate a Turing machine, and we don't know how to make any machine more complicated than that. So that means that we can then emulate any kind of machine using a Turing complete machine. But another place is, these Turing machines describe languages that are recursively enumerable. And in quantum mechanics, we have these things called Feynman integrals, where we're integrating over. We have these things called Feynman diagrams, which are pictures of the possible ways that this interaction could have happened. So we have some inputs and some outputs, and we have a myriad number of ways that we could have had those inputs and outputs, and we're kind of doing a weighted sum over all of these. But if you ask if you take these diagrams can be expressed as a language, and if you ask what kind of language do the rules of these diagrams generate, you find that Feynman diagrams, the things that we're integrating over, form a recursively enumerable language, which suggests that at the very foundational levels, quantum mechanics itself appears at least to have the complexity of a Turing-complete machine. So that means that at all different levels of existence, from the very subatomic particles in the case of Feynman integrals and the wave functions that we have available there, the language of that that we use to describe that, to protein folding in our cells and the ability to process there of reconfiguring the DNA to get to the protein that we want, and then be able to take that portion and then put it all back in a way that produces exactly what we need when we need it. That seems to be a Turing-complete process, and our thought processes that we have are Turing-complete at our level. And then as civilizations get advanced, they start building institutions and governing laws that then have decision points, and with enough complexity, and some of that is even just going to be not necessarily formalized decisions, but just groups acting in a herd mentality on some kind of consensus. At some level of complexity, that also then would allow for some kind of Turing-complete system. I don't believe that we're entirely there yet with our government systems, although we might be getting close, especially with our federal systems, the multi-tiered government systems. Certainly, beehives and anthills, they seem to communicate in a way that would indicate that there's Turing-complete processes happening in those multi-organism systems. That, for this model, that would definitely be some type of consciousness. So based on this model, consciousness might not be a uniquely human thing. It might be something that is actually ubiquitous in all of nature. Wherever non-deterministic processes are happening, when those decision points are made, whether it's at the human level, the societal level, the cellular level, or the fundamental particle level, at whatever levels those are being made, it's possible that there might be some degree of consciousness that's implicit there in that decision-making process, in the non-deterministic free will of whatever entity we're looking at. And I just want to contrast that this is very distinct from consciousness emerging as a computation. So I just want to conclude this by thinking a little bit about consciousness, right? Especially this hierarchy, right? Where, our cells are a consciousness on top of the fundamental particles, and then we're a consciousness on top of our cells. And then there's this perhaps society level where society has a consciousness built on top of us. And maybe we can just see the layers adjacent to us, and maybe the one next to that, and perhaps anything beyond that would be just completely beyond our understanding even to comprehend. But I think that certainly at some point in the last decade, most of us have had the experience where it just felt like our society as a whole has just gone crazy, and how could our society, and when we see a mob of people, it's like, it's been commonly observed that, people are smart, but mobs are stupid. Is there a sense in which individuals are, in some degrees, smarter than the system as a whole? And what would that mean? Is it perhaps the case that, you ever wonder, when you think about this, when I think about this, I wonder, are there times where I've got cells in me that are just going, what the heck is this guy doing? I know that I sometimes ask myself, what the heck is this guy doing? So it certainly would be a reasonable thing for a cell to think. And then, what is consciousness? What is thinking? I think, therefore I am. What does that mean? And I guess I'll just leave it at that.